Good evening. Good to see you all. And Millie, thank you for the announcements and for your prayer and all. And very much looking forward to our session this evening, basically part two of the political philosophy of C.S. Lewis, a topic, as we talked about last week, that's oftentimes rather overlooked or ignored, even by those who have read a lot of C.S. Lewis's writings. But it's a very integral part of his writing career. And of course, we understand that, in a society and culture and political environment like ours in America, we have these two political parties that are radically different. They basically represent virtually two different worldviews. And so an awful lot is at stake. And I don't believe Christians have ever needed to be so attuned, so well informed and engaged in American history than we should be in recent years and right now as well. So these are important issues. And I think Lewis, even though he's writing, 60 years ago or so, Lewis has also a very keen understanding that Western civilization is becoming increasingly secularized and increasingly open to some of the most gross immorality imaginable, and that it's bound to have, a debilitating effect on the quality of our civilization. So we'll talk more about that in detail as we go through this material. But anyway, good to be with you and looking forward to our study. Now, if you're following along in your study guide, I'm going to go back to page 22, just mention just a few things, and then we'll, in just a few minutes here, we'll have covered what we, or we'll have emphasized what some of the key points from last week, and then we'll move on. And it's an awful lot of material, and so I'll try to speed along as much as possible, but as I've said before, don't ever feel like you're interrupting with a salient comment or question or whatever. I always welcome those. So this section in your study guide is entitled Natural Law, Politics, and the Good Society, and all of those aspects are integrated, of course. And in the preface there, C.S. Lewis wrote at one point that politics is a necessary evil. And by the way, he went on to explain, as we mentioned last week, the worse your culture becomes morally, the worse it's going to be, politically as well. And the more attuned we need to be and the more better informed and more engaged than ever. So a point that I oftentimes emphasize when teaching on a topic like this is how can we truly love others as we're enjoined to do by Jesus if we're indifferent toward the kind of laws and public policies and the programs that regulate and oftentimes control their lives? I mean, how can you truly love somebody if you couldn't care less what kind of culture they live in? How can we possibly love others unless we're sensitive to and attentive to not only their religious and spiritual lives, but also their physical, their material, their emotional, their social, their intellectual, and their creative needs as well? So just think about it. Anybody who you truly love, you want the best for them in all of those areas, starting with their spiritual life, obviously, but also encompassing all of those other dimensions of life and what constitutes a quality life as well. So I think it's very clear that we need to understand the importance of politics, even though it can get very, very messy, as we all know. In fact, probably a few years ago, we wouldn't have imagined how messy it can be. But nonetheless, it's still very, very important. And we have an obligation, I think, as Christians to promote as much decency and civility and goodness as possible. And So anyway, we last week talked about Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man. I said it was the best introduction to Lewis's political thought. And as I wrote in the book, C.S. Lewis on Politics, Government, and the Good Society, quote, influenced by G.K. Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man, Lewis's The Abolition of Man is an astute analysis of the philosophical and the moral decline of the West, of Western civilization, or how and why the Western world has gone wrong. As such, the book functions essentially as a primer for everything else that Lewis wrote on the state of Western civilization and culture. Okay. And we talked about how that in talking about these great cultural issues, including political issues, Lewis starts with a basic premise. In other words, the principle of natural law, or as he refers to it, the Tao, or the way. And this is a basic level of morality and decency and civility that we should expect of everybody, regardless of their, situation in life or their religious convictions or anything. This is basically lowest common denominator morality. And so we're not trying to force Christian values explicitly on everybody else, but there is a basic standard level of decency and all that we have every right to expect. Now, most civilizations have recognized a system of values that constitutes a universal law of moral absolutes, or what Lewis refers to as a generally accepted standard of right and wrong. And even some of the worst societies and governments and so on, adhere to that principle to some extent. Now, the concept of universal moral laws is also a biblical concept. It's alluded to by the Apostle Paul in the first and second chapters of Romans, where he says, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen. And he says that in chapter 2, the requirements of the moral law are written on our hearts. And so, again, even if you're living in a Muslim society, Hindu, Buddhist, or communist society, these moral principles, basic moral principles, are written on everyone's heart. I wrote in the book there that natural law theory is controversial because it presupposes a certain moral and that certain moral and ethical principles are absolute and universal, which in turn assumes the existence of a transcendent, eternal, and good God who is the divine source of moral law. Okay. Now, Lewis will argue that once we eliminate moral absolutes, once we want to pretend that everything is relative, and we can pretty much define our own sense of values and morality and so on, we abolish man, he says, as a moral being and a creature made in the image of God. Let's see, there's a few more points I wanted to make before we move on to you recall that on the next page there in your study guide, we have the chart, Natural Law, 20 Basic Principles. There's probably several more that could be added, but I wanted to make it, generally manageable in that respect. And so if you look at those basic moral principles, you know that even some of the worst governments and societies in world history have to some extent abided by those principles, or at least, have incorporated principles like that into their legal codes. Now, whether the elite and the government elite and so on abide by those is a totally different matter. Okay. But people understand that there is fundamentally right and wrong. Not everything is subjective. Not everything is relative. All right. Now, when you look at the section on Lewisian political philosophy. Again, going back to page 22 briefly. The common misconception, as we talked about last week, is that C.S. Lewis had very little interest in politics. And he makes some comments in some of his correspondence with people and some of his writings that would lead one to think that he did not take politics seriously. Well, the problem is he understands how corrupted all political systems are. But having said that, some are far worse than others. In other words, only a fool would prefer to live in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s rather than in Great Britain or the United States. That's an integral part. We're called as Christians to represent Christ and try to contain as much as possible as much overt evil in the world as possible. And that means that oftentimes we have to support politicians and political parties that, are far from being ideal, to say the least, but they're far better than the alternative. Lewis knew that politics, including democratic politics, democratic with a small d, of course, often attracts some of the most ambitious, some of the most power hungry, some of the most unscrupulous, and some of the most manipulative people in society. That's just the reality. It's power hungry people that want to control other people's lives. And of course, in many cases, they want political positions so they can profiteer off of them. Now, we just had, a master example in Joe Biden, not only the absolute most incompetent president in all of American history, which is quite a low standard when you think about it, but also the absolute most corrupt president that we've ever had. Again, this really does muddy the water, and it turns an awful lot of Christians just totally off to any kind of political engagement. But when we do that, we're just, basically, conceding the culture to the very, very worst people imaginable. Now, I go on to talk last week in terms of Lewis's social and political views being based on two sources. And one is, and now we're on page 24 here, one of those influences is natural law ethics. In other words, Lewis believed in an objective moral reality, and this is discoverable by human reason and applicable to human character and behavior. And he's talking about, just laws, which are expressions of natural law. A great example, by the way, is Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And Martin Luther King had a very keen understanding of natural law ethics. Now, he didn't live this out in his personal life, I must say, as many of you are very well aware of. But nonetheless, he did publicly espouse this principle of natural law, a basic moral foundation to which we are all accountable. So Lewis's socio-political views based on two sources. First of all is natural law. Secondly is the classical liberal ideology of John Locke and other early Enlightenment and Western political thinkers. So that idea of classical liberalism, not to be confused with modern liberalism. Modern liberalism is essentially just watered down Marxism, socialism. And of course, he's not talking about that. So this is classical liberalism as defined by John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and some of the other great thinkers in Western civilization back 250, 300 years ago or so. All right, any comments on any of that? And then we're going to break some new ground. Yes, please.
Joe Biden benefited from his politics by getting a lot of personal money, but he's not the only one. There's a lot.
Oh, no, not at all.
And that's why we do get turned off by that a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Where does this
You're
money come from?
absolutely correct. And it's not just the Democratic Party, obviously, but primarily, overwhelmingly, it is Democratic Party. But Joe Biden, yeah, just the worst example of political exploitation, to enrich himself and so on. You're absolutely right. I mean, there's plenty of other examples we could cite. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions?
I mentioned for you, and in their book club that just came out, Michael Knowles is reviewing the Abolition of Man.
Oh, really?
I
Okay.
can't remember the guy he's talking with, but
Oh,
they
okay.
reviewed
It-
that.
Is there a separate website, just PragerU? I
Well,
can't,
I get the emails.
Yeah.
I can send it to you and you can send it.
anyway, you could Google it and,
There's an app on your phone too, through the app.
okay.
Email address.
And Dennis Prager, one of the most astute political thinkers, of our time. And we've all seen the horrible things that have been going on at Columbia University in New York City, for instance. Well, Dennis Prager got his master's degree at Columbia, and he wrote many, many years ago that Columbia University was the most godless place in America. And I think of course, there's a lot of competition for that, but that was his opinion. It was the most godless place in America. But we see plenty of examples of the consequences of that.
It's Neil Shinby.
Oh.
yes.
Doing the Abolition of Man.
Oh, Neil Shinby, who's a well-respected social political commentator. And so that's on PragerU, the Abolition of Man. Okay, thank you.
Under the book club. The Michael Knowles book club.
Oh, okay. Michael Knowles Book
I'll send
Club.
you the link.
Okay. Is that Knowles, Knowles? Okay. All right. Okay, well, let's move on then to the section in your notes on democracy. And Lewis's political views stemmed from a realistic understanding of human nature. That's absolutely essential. If we think human beings are better than they actually are, then we're going to have a mess of a political system that doesn't work. If we think human beings are worse than they actually are, in other words, there's nothing good about humanity, then we're going to have a political system that's that also is just extremely tyrannical and all. But Lewis, like all the great political thinkers, believed that human beings had a problem, an innate problem. In the Bible, it's defined as a sin nature, and therefore we need government. So Lewis is anything but a libertarian. Okay, we need government, and we need laws, and government is a necessary institution. As James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Okay, but I think we all probably could agree that he's quite right about that. Men are not angels, but there again, neither are women. I just wanted to balance the scale. Okay, all right. Now, government is staffed by sinful human beings. So the powers of government need to be carefully controlled. Madison put it this way. He says, in framing a government, which is to be administered by men over men, again, everything was couched in male terminology back then. He says, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed. And in the next place, you must oblige it to control itself, because even the government is full of very flawed, sinful human beings. Again, I think we've all noticed, okay? The Presbyterian clergyman and statesman John Witherspoon wrote, quote, every good form of government must be complex so that one may check the other. He's talking about, the branches of government, okay? And this was one of those ideas that was integrated into the U.S. Constitution, as you know, and the three branches of government. And the idea being that each branch, to some extent, can control or at least modify the actions of others. This idea also actually came from a French political thinker by the name of Baron Montesquieu, and he talked about, quote, separation of powers being absolutely essential, or power checks power, as Montesquieu put it. Now, in Mere Christianity, Lewis comments on what he considers to be the key to history. I got a doctorate in history. Nobody, when I was in grad school, nobody ever taught a philosophy of history. That just wasn't an issue. And I doubt that it's an issue in most any university, a philosophy of history. But I came to the conclusion very soon thereafter that, in fact, we do need a well-developed philosophy of history, and there's obviously no better source than the Bible itself. But anyway, here's Lewis on the key to history. He says, terrific energy is spent building institutions and civilizations, only to have it all destroyed and ruined by the pride of man, the sinful nature of mankind. Sooner or later, the most selfish, the most ambitious, the most cruel people claw their way to the top and bring on misery and ruin. Eventually, the lust for power corrupts most of the good that institutions and civilizations are founded upon. So, you have this life cycle of a civilization. We see it, numerous examples throughout history. So, therefore, liberty, given the fact that we have a flawed, sinful nature, liberty needs to be balanced by private but also public virtue. John Adams put it this way, quote, public virtue cannot exist without private virtue. And public virtue is the only foundation of a republic. He goes on to say, we have no government armed with powers capable of contending with human passions that are unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to govern any other. Okay. Brilliant. So we have this beautiful Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. I only wish that another statue had been constructed, maybe in San Francisco Bay, statue of virtue, because we need to balance, liberty and virtue, or else everything will eventually just fall apart. Benjamin Franklin puts it this way, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. Only a virtuous people can handle freedom. George Washington, the foundations of our national polity will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality. And again, James Madison, we have staked the whole of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves, to control ourselves, to sustain ourselves according to the 10 Commandments of God. So Lewis understands all of this. That's why he has a very high opinion of what we call classical liberalism, such as the political philosophy that was ingrained into our system of government and constitution. He detested the traditional elitist and hierarchical class system that was so prevalent in all European societies and in England and Scotland as well. But Lewis also had very little confidence in democracy. Probably our whole lives we've heard politicians and others, extolling, the great virtues of democracy. Well, Lewis was not a Democrat, small d Democrat. He understood that most people are poorly educated and selfish. They're neither wise nor good. Well, that's just the realities. He probably would have agreed with Winston Churchill's comment that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter, okay, average citizen. It's like, oh Lord. I remember, let's see, I think I was in high school when they wanted to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. And I remember thinking, that's absurd. Instead of lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, they ought to raise it to 25 or so, or maybe 55. Might be better off that way as well. But anyway, the real reason for democracy, according to Lewis, is not that most people are wise and good. It's just the reverse, in fact. He writes, quote, mankind is so fallen that no man can be trusted with unchecked powers over his fellows. So in an essay he writes in 1945 entitled Membership, now this is, right as soon as World War II is ended, 1945, he writes this article, Membership. He expresses his uneasy ambivalence toward democracy. Lewis writes, quote, I believe in political equality, but there are two opposite reasons for being a Democrat, again, small d Democrat. You may think that all men are so good that they deserve a share in the government and so wise that the Commonwealth needs their advice, a view that he said was he adamantly rejected as being false, romantic, and a doctrine, a romantic doctrine of democracy. Conversely, he says, democracy is rooted in the reality that everyone is morally flawed, everyone, from the president on down. And therefore, some form of representative government is necessary because, to cite, the famous phrase by Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So Lewis proceeded to explain that egalitarianism, this fanciful idea that all people are, quote, equal intellectually, morally, and in terms of talent, is totally absurd. And he's absolutely correct about that. In a 1959 letter to an American newspaper editor, Lewis writes, quote, 100 years ago, we all thought that democracy was it. In other words, it was just the pinnacle of, political brilliance and whatever. Neither you nor I think that now. It neither allows the ordinary man to control legislation nor qualifies him to do so. The real questions are settled in secret, and the newspapers keep us occupied with mostly trivial issues. And this is all the easier because democracy always, in the end, destroys education. What's he talking about? Democracy, in the end, destroys education. Democracy, you notice the trends. I mean, it's obvious in our country. It caters to the lowest common denominator. Now, I had taught at one university for quite a few years, and then got an invitation to teach in another one. I won't name the universities, but when I was being interviewed for a position, I asked the dean about standards, academic standards, and he assured, oh yes, we uphold very high standards here. And so the first, I think we're on quarters, not semesters back then. The first quarter I was teaching, one class in particular, about 30% or more dropped the course. And I was thinking, what is going on? I'm teaching the same thing I taught at the other university for years. And, I never had a mass defection so that was very strange to me until the end of the quarter. And back then, a lot of professors still posted grades on their office door. at the end of the quarter. So I go by and start looking at the grade distribution from a lot of these professors, a lot of them the most senior professors. And then it was obvious why 30 or more percent of my students dropped, because all I see are A's and some B's and occasionally a C or something and whatever. And I'm thinking there's no academic standards whatsoever here. And it's gotten far worse. Now that was what, 80 or 100 years ago when, well, you don't have to affirm, right? Said, but, but anyway, I saw that as a trend, obviously. And fortunately, after 5 years there, I was able to go back to the university that I'd left, where there still were some standards, mostly upheld by some of the most senior faculty and all. But the trend was obvious, and my understanding is it's just totally out of control, today.
Partly because it became a business. I mean, they just want to keep kids, when they bring kids, it's money making.
Money.
Yes, absolutely. But also, you're asking 18 and 19-year-old college students to assess the professor and his teaching skills and ability. And so you have to placate them. You have to please them, don't you? I remember students.
Set that up, that you get analyzed by the student.
Yeah, it's a factor. It's a factor. And so you've got, oh dear, I was accused of everything imaginable. One student wrote that I was homophobic. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, that issue never came up in class, to say the least. And of course, a couple of others over the years said I was racist and sexist, of course, and everything else. So, I mean, they can write anything with impunity.
So was that?
Well, when I was at that particular university, it was in the mid-90s. Oh, yeah, yeah. Homophobic and racist and sexist and all that. Yeah, that was very much in vogue back then too. So I think my understanding of what Lewis is saying here is he understands that democracy has a way of, frankly, dumbing down the curriculum and inflating grades and whatever. And that was certainly my experience, in my years.
I'm thinking democracy is that everyone votes for their leaders. Now, we don't have a democracy per se, we have a republic.
Well, but to stay elected, say in office, you have to placate and please, the electorate.
What is what government would be
A better form? Well, the government that the founding fathers set up, which was a constitutional republic. Yeah. And there were certain requirements that a person needed to meet in order to have the right to vote. Now, we can argue about the standards that they set out. I think there's plenty of room to dispute that, but at least they had this idea that some people are just not qualified. Now, unfortunately, that Republican style of government that they set out almost automatically disqualified itself from the beginning because it excluded all women for no reason, no plausible reason whatsoever. It also excluded who? Yeah, all non-whites. Yeah. Say for no defensible reason whatsoever. So unfortunately, they yes, that's right. Early on, it was only property owners. And what would be the thinking behind that? Why only let landowners, property owners vote? What's the
have a stake in it.
Pardon me?
They have a stake in it. all.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, they would not be so prone to join up with every revolutionary fad that came along that wanted to overthrow the whole system. Yeah. hmm So again, the problem here, when all is said and done, is we're dealing with sinful humanity. So there's no simple, easy, foolproof solution. Now, about the same time Lewis was writing on those themes, he wrote an epilogue to the famous Screwtape letters, which were written several years earlier. And then he comes back and he adds an epilogue called Screwtape Proposes a Toast. And that, if you've never read that, I'd very much encourage you to do so. It's in, as far as I know, it's in all of the versions of Screwtape letter that have been published in the last 30 or 40 years. But it is an absolutely scathing critique of democracy. And according to Lewis, democracy is a lowest common denominator form of government. What it does is reward mediocrity, and it rewards social conformity. He says democracy does not want great men or women. Think about it. See, again, I don't find it defensible at all to exclude all women and all non-whites from full citizenship rights. But in the first 30 years or so of the United States, we had generally competent executives, presidents. We had Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and then John Quincy Adams. And all of them, including even John Quincy Adams, were people of great intellect, great ability, and so on. But see, by the time we get to the 1828 election, now the majority of white men are eligible to vote. And we get Andrew Jackson. And then from that point on, through the rest of the century, there's only one president that commands a lot of respect, and that's Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln would never have been elected had the South not seceded from the Union. So he didn't have to contend with Southern Democrats. That's the only way Lincoln ever got elected. And he's the only president in that entire period from 1828 to the turn of the 20th century who you might say was, exceptional. I think he was very exceptional, but he's a political accident. Now, the next exceptional president we get, to some extent, is Theodore Roosevelt. But Theodore Roosevelt was a political accident. See, he would never have been elected president were it not for the fact that he was a very staunch reform advocate in New York State. And so the leaders in the Republican Party in New York State wanted to get him out of there. So they thought, well, let's kick him up to the vice presidency where he'll never be seen or heard from again. And so they promote him as the Republican vice presidential candidate. And then the president gets assassinated. William McKinley gets assassinated. So that's how we got Theodore Roosevelt. Right. So it's a rather disturbing history, to say the least. Now, Lewis puts it this way. He says, democracy is the word with which you must lead the masses by the nose. You already used the word purely as an incantation. It is a name they venerate. And of course, it is connected with the political ideal that everyone should be equally treated, including full, citizenship rights, including voting rights, and so on. He goes on to say, you then make a stealthy transition in their minds from this political ideal to a factual belief that all men are equal. Well, yeah, we're all equal under the law. The law should not discriminate against anybody related to their socioeconomic status or race or, gender or anything. But he goes on to say, under the influence of this incantation, those who are in any and every way inferior can labor more wholeheartedly and successfully than ever before to pull down everyone else to their own level. What I want to fix your attention on is the vast overall movement towards the discrediting and finally the elimination of every kind of human excellence. Moral excellence, cultural, social, and intellectual excellence. So I know this sounds very crude and countercultural to, American ideals and everything, but is it true? And unfortunately, I think you'd have to concede that what Lewis is writing here is in fact true. The democratic mythology teaches that everyone is equal, not just in terms of equal treatment under the law, but also equal in reality. This contributes to the dumbing down of the curriculum, according to Lewis, inflating grades, coddling students, promoting self-esteem over the mastery of facts and logic. And doesn't that so readily define the state of so-called higher education today? And he goes on to say the teachers, or should I say the nurses, will be far too busy reassuring the dunces and patting them on the back to waste any time on real teaching.
And this is all in the Screwtape letters.
Yeah, this comes from, Screwtape letters, the epilogue, Screwtape proposes a toast. So, what a scathing critique of the mentality of the 20th century in America and Britain, and throughout the quote democratic world. Now, occasionally you'll see in the news or on social media or whatever a contemporary college professor essentially saying more or less the same thing that Lewis has said. If they do say something like that, you can rest assured they are tenured. In other words, they can't be fired, okay, or else they would never say that. Lewis goes on to say, democracy leads to a nation without great men or women, a nation mainly of subliterates, morally weak from lack of discipline in youth, full of the cocksuredness which flattery breeds on ignorance, and soft from lifelong pampering. And that is what hell wishes every democratic people to be. So, oh dear.
That was then.
So I go back-
That was 60, 70 years ago.
So I guess I go back to, you always, every man, one vote. Every man, one vote. So, I mean, how do you devise a fair political system where it doesn't get done?
Where it does not get dumbed down. Well, history would teach us that it's almost an inevitable decline.
Yeah.
It's a very good question you raise. I'm not sure I have a good answer.
Yes, Lewis is a good commentary of it, but does he offer a solution or
Well, not that I'm aware of, frankly, because it's so countercultural. Now here's Janet Verba responding. Janet is a teacher at a high school in Cobb County.
Yes, but don't say anything else about that.
Well, I'm not going to give out your social security number or anything like that, Janet. But Janet writes that the administration is pushing inflation grading. When teachers are grading and failing students based on competence, the administration is emailing the teachers to request meeting in person. It has created fear with teachers who don't want to compromise their integrity. Janet, is there anything else you'd like to add before
Yeah,
I take your
I
Social
also
Security?
attached a recent news story of the teenager who graduated from a Connecticut high school, and she's suing her school district because they just passed her on. She's alleging she can't read, and she graduated from high school, so she's suing them. And I put that link in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I saw that being mentioned on
And if that
on
goes
TV a couple of weeks ago. So when I was teaching at the first university, a lot of the senior faculty were what I would describe as kind of old-line liberals. In other words, they were fans of FDR and John Kennedy and that sort of thing. And a lot of them were very, very decent, relatively decent, honorable people who upheld standards. The problem with liberals like that, however, is that they were very tolerant of people to the left of them on the political spectrum, not to the right. And so over time, you see the pendulum moving. And the newer, younger faculty who come in are almost exclusively left-wing, sometimes radically left-wing. And these are the people who believe that grades are, what would they use? Grades are what?
In the past.
Yeah, it's based on faulty standards and so on. Yeah, and so by the way, this trend started in the Ivy League schools in Stanford, places like that, along with eliminating all core curriculum. And so it's the results pretty obvious if you trace it over the last 50 or more years. So Janet,
Yeah,
one more.
could I add something? It's just shocking for me. I'm teaching in high school. It's my third career, so I was out in the business world. But I showed the Declaration of Independence the other day, reading a historical document, which is a skill they need to do. And I was 1 or 2 minutes into the lesson before I realized they can't read the original document because we've stopped teaching our students how to handwrite with cursive writing. And that frightens me as an American to know that there are generations that will not be able to go back to the original documents to read. And I just think that just sets us up to be deceived in so many ways with the internet. If the future cannot read these original documents by our founding fathers or other historical documents.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Janet. And our prayers are certainly with you and everyone else who's trying to uphold standards, including, moral standards, as I know you do. And the trends are definitely counter to that.
Thank you.
Yes, Bruce.
Interesting sidelight maybe. Chinese is an extraordinarily difficult language. When the communists took over, of course, there was a lot of issues about people couldn't read. And so they commissioned the creation of a simplified set of characters, like fewer strokes and not so complicated. And there's all stories about it was wonderful in the 50s, the workmen would go to the fields and they have a placard on the back with a character. So the guy who was going behind them could see the character and get to learn it. And then they switched things and they were all busy learning how to read. The problem was that if you read If you read the old style characters and then learned the simplified form, you could still read the old style characters. But if you learned the new style characters, you really had a very great deal of difficulty reading the old style characters. And the result was that it cut the Chinese population literally off from all of their literary and historical heritage. Intentionally.
Yeah, yeah,
Intentionally.
yeah.
Notice a government doing good and increasing literacy among the masses.
Wow.
Right?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that was an integral part of Mao's agenda.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Colleen.
How many years they quit doing cursive, and isn't it back now? Isn't it true? that it's back?
Janet, there's a question. How many years have they stopped doing cursive, teaching cursive? And-
Unfortunately, I don't know for sure because I'm a high school teacher.
Mhm.
So I'm not in the elementary where they would be learning that, but it's at least been definitely since the pandemic, because the kids I've had for the last couple of years, they can't read cursive.
My
I have to
daughter
print
is,
everything.
yeah, my daughter is in 4th grade and they do teach them cursive.
Yeah.
So they,
There are
they
exceptions.
restarted that. There was
Oh,
a
I
lot
hope they
complaint
are.
about it and they restarted it. So she learned cursive in 3rd grade, but was excited that she got to start early in 2nd grade.
Okay. So you think, at least in some schools, it's being recovered? I'm sorry.
It's been put back in the curriculum. So I'm
Yeah, it's
not sure if the teachers are teaching it, but it's in the
Oh,
curriculum.
Andrea, the question is your daughter in public or private or
She's in public
alternative?
school,
Yeah.
in public school.
Okay, good. Well, I know also that arithmetic, just basic arithmetic is, not taught, at least not taught well, and in most schools, but I'm sure there's exceptions, like Andrea just mentioned. Yes, please.
Another sign that our society is in trouble, at
Mhm.
least in respect to the fact that we're governed by a democracy type of government,
Mhm.
is Fox News. I don't know how many of you watch Fox News, but they tend to get a lot of mileage out of these people that go around and ask questions of the common person on the street. And, it's maybe related to the current historical event of the day, or whose birthday is it, or who was the president during World War II, or who was the president when our country was founded.
Yeah.
Franklin Roosevelt was when the country was founded. Abraham Lincoln, no, they don't know any of these
Yeah.
facts and the
Yeah.
people, and they, to put Abraham Lincoln up as a fine example, I agree with you, but many of the students today don't know anything about it.
No. Yeah, those kind of man on the street comedy acts started with the old Tonight Show with Jay Leno. And at the time, we were just astonished, but that's been going on now for what, 30, 40 years. And you're not shocked by anything anymore. Yes.
I want to say about the math curriculum, if they did teach my boys who are in their early 20s now, radically different from how I learned, and it was frustrating to me at the time. But now they can explain how they think. And I used to be very frustrated that they had to explain a lot of the things in math. Just do it, just solve it. But they can write essays, they can explain and get words out of their mouths, unlike me. I'm not getting them out. But
So,
it's not all bad, is what I'm saying.
okay, I have to say, I really don't know about it, about any of that. I mean, but, for thousands of years, we've just assumed that you need to memorize addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. Yeah. So I know anytime we might go to a fast food place and, pay in cash, it's always quite an adventure watching the cashier operate. So anyway, well,
I just want to add, I went ahead and looked it up. Just on February 21st this year, the House Bill 580 was presented so that at the beginning of the 2026-27 school year for the state of Georgia, they want to, they say education must provide instruction in cursive writing for grades determined by the State Board of Education. So it looks like they want to bring it in, but there's actually opponents who question the necessity of cursive writing, saying that our resources could be better allocated to teaching digital literacy, which is important, but I don't think we should not learn print and handwriting.
Yeah. Yeah, sounds like a lot of wasted time. They could be teaching gender identification. So
So far, because with all the new technology with the
mhm,
brainwave and AI stuff,
mhm.
they don't really, you know, schools should not allow them to use that sort of stuff. But,
Yeah. Yeah, it's and when you look at the trends in general, there's cause for questioning, challenging, concern about most all these trends, but I'm sure they're not all wrong. But generally, it's a troubling, trend, I'd say. All right, well, let's take a look here at two threats to civilization on page 24 in the study guide. And in his political writings, Lewis focused on the two most ominous threats in his mind to civilization. One was technocracy. Now, not technology per se, but technocracy, a secular, humanistic, and soulless scientific, technological, industrial complex that he thought was taking over and exerting far too much power and influence. A good example of this is in his space trilogy, in which in all three of those books, the villain is always a scientist. Time magazine put it this way when it debuted C.S. Lewis on the cover back in 1947. Time wrote, quote, "The consistent identification of scientists with the forces of evil is characteristic of Lewis. To him, scientists seem most nearly to embody the sin of pride." Okay. And now, we have lived through the age of Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins. So we perhaps can identify with that to some extent. Now, there was a brilliant book written in the mid-1950s by Jacques Ellul. And Ellul was a French philosopher. He was a sociologist. He was a rather unorthodox Christian. But Ellul was, in some regards, a very astute thinker. He was very moral and all. And he essentially agreed with Lewis's perception of the dangers of technocracy, where technologists basically set the agenda. Okay. And so Ellul feared that the cult of modern technology posed the greatest threat to human freedom and religious faith. In the technological society, he wrote, what matters is that something is new. There's this worship of anything new, and something is more efficient, with absolutely no regard as to its spiritual or its moral effects. For scientists and technocrats, according to Ellul, the question is always, can we do this, rather than should we do this? That can be a major problem, can't it? And let's see, I had a comment on that, but I think I'll move on here. So the number one threat, according to Lewis, is technocracy, but also a world welfare state, as he put it. In other words, a secular, socialist, new world order. Okay. Which, of course, he was always very concerned about the power that an organization like the United Nations might finally acquire to supersede national laws and so on. Now, in Mere Christianity, so let's move on here to Ruminations on the Good Society. In Mere Christianity, the book 3, chapter 3, a chapter called Social Morality, Lewis set forth a few common sense guidelines for a good and just society and a good and just government based on natural law principles. The intent of that chapter was to show how Christian values could influence the social and political systems in a good society. We can influence them, we can't dictate everything. But regarding the Bible and government, Lewis believed that Scripture provides guidance for political ends, but not necessarily for political means. And when you think about it, yeah, that's obviously true. Given the radically different culture in which the New Testament was written, Christians should not expect the New Testament to provide a, quote, detailed political program for governing society. Good government operates according to the principles of natural law for the good of everybody, but it should not be expected to enforce specifically Christian standards. That's where we go back to natural law, lowest common denominator of morality and ethics that we should hold everyone to account for. Now, as Christians, we're called to a much higher standard, but that's not something we can impose on everybody else, okay? In 1945, he writes an essay called Christian Apologetics, in which he argues that point. He says, a good society should not be confused. In other words, a good society should not be confused with Old Testament theocracy. We have to keep in mind that Old Testament Israel was a unique nation in history. Unique means one and only nation in history. Lewis put it this way, I believe that no man or group of men is good enough to be trusted with uncontrolled power over others. And the higher the pretensions of such power, the more dangerous. So he concludes, therefore, theocracy is the absolute worst form of government, theocracy. And other great thinkers like Francis Schaeffer would agree as well. Likewise, a good society would not be a sacralistic society governed by the union of church and state. That always leads to a very corrupt religious system, okay, without exception in history. We should not try to impose specifically Christian standards of personal morality on mainstream society. It's counterproductive. This would be coercive, and therefore it would violate the spirit of the gospel and the credibility of the Christian faith. We're going to punish you if you don't, even pretend to believe, in all these Christian values and whatever. Sins should only be treated as crimes, he said, to the extent that they cause demonstrable harm on another person or other people. Therefore, most behavior between consenting adults should be tolerated. Now, what's that word even mean? What does tolerated mean? Yeah, but do you tolerate your spouse or do you love your spouse? Big difference, right? When we tolerate somebody or something, it means that we generally disapprove or disagree, but we understand that we have no right to try and force our values on that other person or people. So in other words, the point here is simply that the highest Christian values we cannot force on others. So in other words, we must be, quote, tolerant, but that doesn't mean that we agree or approve of what they're doing or saying or whatever. And we certainly don't want to promote what they do or say. or celebrate it. Now, that's the great transition we've seen since the 1960s, and that is prior to the 60s, to some extent or another, certain vices were tolerated to some extent. But since the 60s and the 70s, some of the worst, most evil, practices and behavior and so on are not just tolerated, they're actively celebrated and promoted. We saw that in the Biden administration. It was horrible. And so that's the point he's making. And I think it's a very, very valid point. There's a lot of things that people say and do and all that we wish they did not. So we can certainly disapprove. But now it seems like those in positions of cultural influence don't just want to tolerate it, they want to promote and celebrate it and try and normalize it. And
punish you if you don't.
yeah, and punish.
celebrate.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
you never
right.
celebrate.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So this is an interesting issue that Lewis is making. And of course, he's writing in the 40s and 50s and all. So the question that comes up in my mind is, okay, what about abortion? Should that be tolerated or promoted or celebrated? Well,
Tolerated.
well, I'd say not even tolerated, because it's the most.
Saying that would, I mean,
Mhm.
of course not so.
Yeah.
It's
It's the most fundamental human right, isn't it? It's even, Thomas Jefferson even put it first in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And without the right to life, nothing matters. Nothing else matters, does it?
That you would say abortion, which I agree, does not fall into this category of.
No.
Does not impose Christians.
No. I think it's a basic human right
Yes.
that needs to be upheld. What about prostitution? What about pornography? What about drugs? And so on. So for time's sake, I really need to move on, but there's a strong case that can be made against prostitution. Obviously pornography, drugs, certain drugs that are mind altering and to an extreme and so on.
Problem that we tolerate this sort of stuff and don't condemn it.
Yeah, well, that's my point, is that I don't believe any of that, frankly, should be tolerated.
So what is Lewis talking about?
Well, again, say he's writing in the 40s and 50s. So back then, no, abortion is not a major issue. I'm not sure. I hadn't thought about it. Probably prostitution and things like that would be my guess. Now, likewise, and contrary to modern so-called social justice Christianity, we should not try to impose specifically New Testament social and economic values on mainstream society. See, biblical, moral, and social and economic values are for the voluntary society of the church. Mainstream society is not and never will be Christian. Of course, mainstream society would be far better if more people lived by biblical values, of course. But there are reasonable limits to which we can insist that non-Christians accept Christian values. Very definite limitations. So Lewis will go on to argue that a good society would not celebrate or promote blatant immorality, like prostitution and pornography and all that sort of thing, nor should it celebrate and promote hedonism, just unrestricted, hedonistic behavior, materialism, and irresponsible behavior and lifestyles. Based on natural law principles, a good society would promote harmony between people, and it would cultivate the traditional cardinal virtues in its education system and in society in general. Cardinal virtues, especially prudence, in other words, moral common sense, temperance, which means what? Moderation, yeah. Justice, which is fairness and equal treatment under the law, and fortitude, the courage to do what's right. The New Testament provides some principles on what an ideal society would be like. A good society would operate on the principle of the golden rule. You know, that's what a good society would do. And so Lewis will go on to tell us that in some respects, a good society would be, quote, a conservative society, one that honors certain traditional values, such as the basic principles of natural law and classical liberal political ideology. Also, traditional morals and manners, honesty, decency, civility. Also, respect for one's elders, traditional family values, respect for authority, individual responsibility. Lewis puts it this way. In a good society, there would be, quote, no passengers and no parasites. What's that supposed to mean? People, yeah, people.
Want a free ride.
Yeah,
Yes.
she was talking about somebody's gotta drive the train,
Mm-hmm.
somebody's gonna be a passenger on the train, somebody's gonna be working on the train.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you gotta have a passenger, you gotta have, and then there's somebody, gonna be somebody hanging on the side of it.
Mm-hmm.
So you got a parasite,
Mm-hmm.
you got a passenger. To people who are working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and as we read, of course, in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, if a man does not work, he ought not to eat. Now, we know that there are people that, you know, for unusual circumstances and all, you know, cannot work, but nonetheless, as a general principle, social welfare programs should always be administered as temporary means of help in unusual situations. People who truly are victims of misfortune. And there's lots of people like that, and we need to respect them, care for them, and so on. But in the traditional understanding, I guess, of American history, who's the president that that initially begins the socialistic trends? FDR. FDR. Now,
when Lyndon Johnson had the Great Society.
Yeah, well, that's 30 years later, yeah. But here's FDR in 1935. Quote, the federal government should and will get out of this business of relief. To dole out welfare is to administer a narcotic, a subtle destroyer of the human will. That's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat in 1935. Unfortunately, in the 1960s, as you mentioned, under LBJ's Great Society, welfare was redefined as a right or as an entitlement. And we see the consequences of that in most every area of life.
And wasn't he racially motivated? Yeah, wasn't that done to get voters?
Oh, yeah, I don't doubt that. Yeah.
Didn't
Yeah.
the African American population voting for the next 200 years?
Yeah, he did make a comment like that later. And so, yes, please, Donna.
It's on page 31 in your book, but it's very applicable now. Where Lewis was talking about the, you know, people voting and not voting and the egalitarian society and the fallacy of that, but he says, we can't trust those who cannot be trusted to vote responsibly and in the public interest because they are perpetual welfare recipients who naturally support politicians who promise them the most benefits from the public treasury. We thought that people who were getting public assistance should be excluded from voting. Didn't say that out loud in public, but I think that's a marvelous idea.
Yeah.
And just like we just said, they will buy votes then, just like Biden's been trying to buy votes with.
And I think it is a valid point you're making, because public assistance except again, in those unusual circumstances, public assistance should be temporary. So if for a year or two or three or whatever, you lose the right to vote because you're on public welfare, then, I don't see a problem with that. But again, we have to allow for those that cannot work. Yeah. Now, a good society would respect and honor good work. Lewis puts it this way: everyone's work should produce something good. In other words, something of true value. There would be no manufacture of silly luxuries and then sillier advertisements to persuade us to buy them. Wow.
Yeah.
Truer words were never spoken, I think. Now, when our kids were growing up, I always insisted that they read a book by E.F. Schumacher called Good Work. It's a brilliant book. And again, for time's sake, I don't have time to really talk about it to any extent. But this is what E.F. Schumacher says in that book, Good Work. A person's work is undoubtedly one of the most decisive, formative influences on his character and personality. But the question of what the work does to the worker is hardly ever asked. From this, Schumacher says, I derive three purposes of human work. First, to provide necessary and useful goods and services. Necessary and useful. Again, Lewis said, all these silly, luxuries and that sort of thing. Secondly, good work, the purpose of human work is to enable every one of us to use and therefore thereby perfect our gifts like good stewards. Our abilities in every aspect of life, those are something God has granted to us. And we need to, follow through as good stewards. And then thirdly, to do so in service to and cooperation with others, so as to liberate ourselves from our inborn egocentrism. So in other words, good work is the production of valuable goods and services for the benefit, the edification, you might say, of other people. In some regards, Lewis says, a good society would be socialistic. We are only a few minutes from closing out our class. I would love to talk in some detail about this idea that a good society would be in some respects socialistic. We just finished talking about how he said that a good society would be in many respects, quote, conservative. But I spell it out pretty completely, his argument in my book there, and I would really encourage you to read that. Let me just summarize in this regard, again, for time's sake.
Real quick, what was the book you uplifted?
Oh, that's the book I wrote, C.S. Lewis, on politics, government, and the good society.
Okay, thank you.
She's not talking about the.
Or were you talking about E.F. Schumacher and good work?
No, whatever the last book was, you
Yeah, it's mine on C.S. Lewis.
And on page 37, it's the ruminations on the good society.
Pardon me?
The ruminations on good society.
Okay, page 37 in my book, Ruminations on the Good Society. Okay, and again, I would highly encourage you to do that, because I know that probably most all of us are generally very conservative in our political orientations. And so I think you'd find it very valuable to read that section where Lewis is saying, in some regards, a good society would be, quote, socialistic. But of course, like everything, we have to define exactly what he's talking about when he uses that term socialistic, okay? Not to be misleading or anything. So in summary, as far as our calling as Christian citizens, politics and government matter. We can't not truly love others if we do not care about the kind of society and culture and laws that influence and govern their lives. As citizens in a relatively free nation, probably the freest nation, I guess, on earth, it's irresponsible not to be well informed and actively engaged in the great issues of our time. And we oftentimes quote Edmund Burke, all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men and women do nothing. And Millie oftentimes ends her Watchman newsletter, with that admonition, and it's very, very wise saying. In his 1945 essay, Membership, Lewis emphasized that what matters most is not a nation or a civilization, but the spiritual state of individuals. And he says there will come a time when every civilization, every nation, every culture, every institution will become extinct. And yet individual will, and yet each individual will still be alive, for better or for worse. He says, it was not for societies or nations that Christ died, but for mankind. And then I talk a bit about his comments in Mere Christianity along these lines. He says, if individuals live only 70 years, then a nation or a civilization is more important than individuals, because a civilization or a nation could last 1,000 years. But if Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, because an individual is everlasting. So I'll finish with this. Ultimately, Lewis cared about the relationship between government and its citizens because political systems, laws, and policies can either help or hinder people in realizing their purpose in life. Just imagine, if we were living right now in Pakistan or someplace like that, Nigeria, or, probably 120 other countries in the world. What an incredible blessing. 4% of the world population is privileged to live in America. And then, if you watch the news, you see how many people hate America. They hate the Christian influences that made America what it is today. Absolutely hate it and want to savagely destroy it. In that regard, we must be informed and vigilant and active in terms of exposing and defeating politicians whose agenda poses the greatest threats to what is true and what is good and what is beautiful. And given the realities of human nature, the first principle of politics has to be this. Now, again, think realistically about human beings and human societies. I say the first principle of politics should be that it's mostly about damage control. In other words, keeping the very worst people and the very worst political parties out of power. And I think so many Christians don't get it. And they think that if a politician isn't up to their standards, then they're not going to vote for him or her. And that's a concession to the very worst. And we need to think beyond that and understand that it's keeping the very worst people out who will do the most damage. And that is a moral responsibility. And we need to take that very, very seriously. Any comments, questions? I think our time is about expired.
Well, just with the work, I think about when God created us, and He created us for work. and helpful. He knows that's good for us.
Yes,
It's very fulfilling to
Yes.
finish a job or
Yes.
to do something that's worthwhile.
yeah,
And if you don't have a
Mm.
purpose, just what a waste of your life that is, whatever it might be. Do it
Yes,
well.
that's
It's
right.
Washing the dishes or scrubbing the floor, taking care of your family, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And he made us that way, to have that desire. It's so.
Well,
important.
well said. One of our children is in HVAC. And, that's not a real high status occupation. But it's absolutely important. And he takes such pride in his work. And it's just,
Got his own company?
no, he doesn't have his own company, but he works for a company that treats him well and respectfully and so on. And so good point you make, Millie.
Whatever it
And
might be.
any good work, going back to E.F. Schumacher's book, any good work is worthy of great respect. And that includes the person you pay at the window when you go through a drive-in restaurant, McDonald's or whatever. Those people are very much worthy of our respect. Bruce, did you have a comment?
Well, I don't need to start a big long discussion, but we said God, created man for work for man. I don't recall that was a characteristic of the garden, but I do recall God condemning men to work, and women to have pain in childbirth and all these sort of things after the fall. That's a different story. So there's some reconciliation that there's one there with people.
They were to tend.
Yeah, they gave it more.
They
And
were
then the-
content to take care of the garden.
Yes.
I don't know what that means in paradise.
You enjoy it.
Take the flower.
Somebody has.
Doesn't mean parasite.
All right. Well, good to see you all. Thanks for joining us. Those of you online, it's wonderful to be able to see you all and interact with you to one extent or another. And so blessings on the rest of your week. By the way, Andrea made a comment. I have a grade schooler and they have started teaching cursive. Yeah, okay. Yeah, very good. Well, thank you. And we'll continue on in our study of C.S. Lewis next week. We have, I think, only about 4 or 5 more weeks. And so much left to cover. And
It was great to be with
wonderful
all of
to
you.
see you. Blessings.
God
Bye-bye.
bless you. Bye.
Thank you.